Exactly what would Gio's future hold? Ernesto felt a pang of shame that he himself hadn't been the one to think of Gio's future and push him. He also felt somehow that cleaning cars was just the beginning. From the second-floor balcony window, Silvia Rossi had been watching the two men. She was holding a picture in her hand. It was a picture of Sergio at the prize ceremony of his last professional circuit race. Silvia was stood beside him, smiling. Sergio was holding a baby in one arm and a frothing bottle of champagne in the other. A tear rolled down Silvia's cheek. She sighed and returned the picture to the bedside table, unlatched her suitcase, and began to place the blouses, lingerie, and other items back in the drawers. On the terrazza, Sergio was bright red in the face. His cheeks red and puffed out, he exploded and gasped for air, grabbing the edges of the table to support himself. He looked down, red-eyed, to the craggy rock pools to witness Gio bursting from the blue sea in a huge explosion of white spray. He held a huge silvery fish aloft in the air victoriously, as if to show an imaginary crowd the spoils of his dive. Sergio grimaced at him, shook his head with disgust at his inability to win the breathing game, then reflected back upon his agreement with Ernesto. He smiled and nodded to himself in a self-congratulatory manner and continued reading the paper whilst eating a slice of buttered toast. "Yes, we will see, young Gio. We will see, won't we?" he said cheerfully. That evening, Ernesto sat down in a simple wooden chair by the small adobe fireplace in their little whitewashed stone cottage. He decided now was as good a time as any to tell Gio about his new job. He threw a small log on the fire and set a pan to heat up on the iron skillet beside it. He laid 2 clean fillets of white fish in the pan, and they began to sizzle. Gio was sat at the small wooden table tearing a chunk off a large baguette of bread. "This is a good fish you caught today, Gio," said Ernesto as he poked the fillet around the pan with a small, slender stick of wood. The fire cracked and popped as fat spat from the pan. He sprinkled a handful of oregano over the fish and dropped a couple of garlic cloves in alongside. "Yes, Papa, a tricky one. It took 3 dives to catch him, but I never let them get away. Never," replied Gio proudly. Ernesto smiled. "I was talking to Signore Rossi about you today," said Ernesto. Gio looked surprised to hear that Signore Rossi even knew his name, and suddenly became worried that he was about to receive a scolding. "Signore Rossi?" asked Gio suspiciously. "Yes, he has seen you from his terrazza. Signore Rossi is most impressed with your fishing. He thinks you have a talent for it," said Ernesto. He flipped the fish over and pushed them around the pan. He squished the garlic cloves to a mush and swirled them around in the oil. Gio looked surprised. A talent for fishing? Who would have thought it? "But he wants you to work for him instead. It's time for you to stop wasting your days swimming and wandering about the hills," continued Ernesto. Gio felt his stomach drop. "I like swimming, and what would we eat during the summer if I didn't catch fish?" said Gio, desperately trying to think of a reason to get out of it. A job was the last thing Gio wanted. "Never mind that. We are to eat in the main house while you're working," said Ernesto. He took the pan over to the table and slid the fillets onto a large ceramic dish. Gio wasn't listening anymore. Fishing and swimming were all that he wanted to do. Gio picked up his fork and furiously stabbed the piece of fish on his plate. "Doing what?" demanded Gio. "You're going to be doing something very important, now stop sulking," replied Ernesto impatiently. "What's so important that I must do it?" "You're to clean Signore Rossi's cars," said Ernesto with an embarrassed cough as he began to eat his fish. "Cleaning cars?" shouted Gio as he stood up waving his fork in the air. "I hate cleaning and I hate cars. Why can't Bernardo clean them? He's the driver, not me." He threw the fork on the plate, stormed off, and threw himself into the chair by the fire. "That's enough, Gio," shouted Ernesto. "You're lucky to get any kind of job at all these days. Signor Rossi is my boss, and, well, we have no choice. Now just go to bed. You have a long day ahead of you tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" complained Gio. "But I've made plans already." "I'm sorry, Gio, but Signor Rossi wants you to start tomorrow." Ernesto sighed. He pushed his plate away and took a little porcelain pipe from his shirt pocket and filled it with tobacco. He struck a match and began to draw upon it, releasing large puffs of lazy white smoke into the air. He walked over and threw the dead match on the fire. The matter was closed. He sat back in the second fireside chair and closed his eyes. Gio leapt up and marched off without saying another word. Ernesto startled and followed him wide-eyed as he went to his room, then once again closed his eyes and tried to forget the events of the day. Gio laid his head on his pillow. A fiery rage began to rise uncontrollably inside him. For a boy without a mother, he had learnt very early in his life that crying at Papa achieved at best nothing, or at the very least a quick slap to the legs. The cold, silent treatment worked best, but he had a feeling this time that things were out of Papa's hands. Bloody Sergio Rossi, he thought. Why can't Bernardo clean his bloody cars? Gio was changing physically and emotionally, and recently had begun to experience dramatic and seemingly uncontrollable mood swings. Simple things would leave him in a state of wild anger. Incapable of any rational thought, he would rage until his face went bright red. His friends laughed at him and said it was something called puberty and that he should ask his father about it. Gio couldn't ask his father anything. His father didn't understand him, and tonight was just another example of that. However, tonight, Gio was afraid. Something had changed, but this wasn't his father's doing. It was Signore Rossi. Why was he interfering in his life? Gio had watched over the last few years as the other boys he used to play with suddenly stopped swimming, and now he wondered if this was the same thing, that his childhood was now behind him. Swimming and being left alone were the only two things that mattered to him, but he knew there was more to life than this. Gio had also started to notice the pretty girls that worked at the estate house, or the foreign tourists that had recently begun to arrive in summer on the Mondello beach. Last month, on a day trip to Trapani, he had seen dozens of girls in bikinis, eating ice cream and sunbathing, and he couldn't stop himself from staring at them. Since that day, his thoughts had become confused, and now this evening, he was no longer sure that he would get to become a world-famous deep-sea diver like Jacques Cousteau. Stupid cars, he thought. I don't want to clean stupid cars. Why did this man pick me? I don't want his stupid job. Why me? After an hour or so, he calmed down enough to imagine himself catching fish, diving to the bottom of the sea, and then finally, before he fell asleep, kissing one of the pretty town girls in a bikini.